It's the Awesemo NBA Preseason live before lock show. Greg Ehrenberg here, joined by Adam Scherer once again. Guys, subscribe to the Awesemo Podcast Network, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and don't forget to give our video a thumbs up as you're watching. So, Adam, second day of preseason. Did you have any big takeaways from the first night of preseason?
Not really. I think it mostly went as expected. In a lot of cases where we hadn't really gotten news on what to expect playing time wise, you saw, around 20 minutes for regulars. I think one thing that maybe, and you don't want to read too much into it because it's one day, but maybe one thing that I was not considering or putting quite enough weight in is that a lot of these rookies, this is really their first time playing, with their teammates and against some NBA competition. So maybe a little bit more rust, a little bit more nerves, stuff like that. I know kind of what made me think of it was Derrick Rose talking about Killian Hayes being, really hesitant to shoot the ball basically, and, kind of deferring more than you would expect him to. So maybe a little bit more risk, I guess, or lower floors on rookies than maybe you would normally be used to at this point in the season.
It's funny you mentioned rookies because the betting odds, Obi Toppin had a ridiculous amount of line movement in his favor to win Rookie of the Year based on one game yesterday. He went from like plus 800 to win Rookie of the Year on FanDuel to now he's almost even with LaMelo Ball as the favorite. So that's also a little bit of big market bias where we just got Knicks fans who are like, oh my God, Obi Toppin scored 11 points or whatever ended up being his first game, and they want to load up on him. But yeah, I think that makes sense a little bit. And then also something to consider, not really a good rookie draft class. So that's another reason to think that there's probably going to be a little bit of jitters there is the players, like there isn't a Zion, there isn't a Ja Morant in this draft class or anything like that. So that is another reason that maybe there was something where we overrated the rookies a little bit on yesterday's slate.
Yeah, and again, you don't want to read too much into it. I mean, there were young guys that did well also. It's just, maybe like normally in preseason, you don't really have those concerns because these guys have been in workouts and they're ready to go. Whereas now it's kind of their first time just getting with everybody.
Yeah, and then speaking of rookies, we do kind of have an interesting situation. The first game of the slate, the Hornets playing the Raptors, because we got the Hornets starting lineup. I thought LaMelo Ball was a pretty safe bet to be in the Hornets starting lineup, at least for the preseason. I assumed he was going to start in the regular season also. That doesn't seem like it's going to be the case because the Hornets starting lineup, Terry Rozier, Devontae Graham, Gordon Hayward, PJ Washington, and Cody Zeller. Now, with that said, these guys are not really expected to play much in the fourth quarter, minutes around 20 for each of them. So how viable do you think LaMelo Ball is, or any of these Charlotte Hornets starters, considering that they're probably not going to play all that much?
Yeah, they're a team that my opinion of them has really changed throughout the day because early on we had a quote or statement from James Borrego talking about needing to play, basically wanting to focus on getting his top 10 to 12 guys in shape and ready to go for the regular season opener. Then you get the quote later in the day, about a half hour ago, that he doesn't plan on any of those guys playing more than 20 minutes. So they went from being a team that I was really interested in to a team that I'm much less interested in now. You still obviously in tournaments can look to take shots on those guys for raw points, whether it's Devontae Graham or Hayward or something. But as far as priority plays and guys that I'm building around, it's just really difficult to prioritize anyone that is going to get around 20 minutes unless it's someone, that produces at an elite rate like a Luka or a Giannis. But with those guys being on this slate, it makes it even more difficult to look to, a $6K or $6,500 guy that is likely to play 19 minutes and average around the fantasy point per minute.
Yeah, I do wonder if these guys are going to go a little bit over-owned also just because we have the starting lineup here, right? There's 7 games on tonight's slate. At least as of now, we only have a few starting lineups. So maybe there's going to be bias where people put in their lineup and just like, hey, I want to lock in these guys because I know they're playing and I don't know what to make of the later guys. So I don't think these guys really make for particularly great plays. They're much higher priorities for me. If I had to roster one player from the Hornets, I guess it would be LaMelo Ball 5,100. But with that said, we talked about some of the rookies struggled yesterday. And LaMelo Ball also coming off the bench, he's probably only going to play around 20 minutes. And it's not like he's Killian Hayes, who is, 4,400 yesterday. There's a little bit more we have to pay for LaMelo Ball at 5,100. So all in all, I think the Hornets are actually probably one of my lowest priority teams on this slate.
Yeah, same for me. And I think that probably will be the case as far as ownership goes. I think you saw it to some extent yesterday, and it's just something that you see even during the regular season. People want to kind of be sure that the guys that they're rostering are going to play or going to start. And so it gives you that advantage in tournaments of late swapping later once you have more information, but it also drives up ownership on some of these early guys. And I do expect that to be the case.
All right, so moving over to the Raptors side of the game, we know that Kyle Lowry's out. We also have a starting lineup for Toronto. Fred VanVleet, Norman Powell, OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, and Aaron Baines. On the Raptors side of the game, also fairly expensive pricing here also. I mean, Pascal Siakam, 7,100. That's a lot to pay for him. Fred VanVleet, 6,600. I think the one guy who makes the most sense is probably Anunoby at 4,600. I think he's somebody who's poised to have a pretty decent year. The other thing also is that with Ibaka gone, with Marc Gasol gone, they want to play Anunoby a little bit more at center this year. And he only had, I think it was like 180 minutes or something like that at center last year. I think that he's somebody who might play a couple extra minutes than the other guys just to get him those center minutes to see what the different lineups look like him there.
Yeah, I think that he's cheap enough and also has that forward eligibility that makes him a little bit more valuable. I was interested, or potentially had interest in Van Vliet with Lowry out, because in the first preseason game last year, you actually got pretty heavy minutes for Van Vliet and Siakam in particular, but 4 out of the 5 starters played at least 21 or 22 minutes. But you now have Nick Nurse saying that he intends to kind of limit the minutes of his veterans, and that included Van Vliet. So there's still at least, I think, some uncertainty as far as exactly what that means. It's not like he gave a specific number, but it at least sounds like Van Vliet, unlikely, I think, to get the 25 or 26 minutes that he played last year. So it really takes him out of like cash consideration for me, and I'd be looking to cheaper guys. You also had Nick Nurse kind of saying that he wants to see what he has from some players that he's not as familiar with. So while I think you certainly can make an argument for someone like a Chris Boucher, maybe getting substantial minutes off the bench, and we know he's a great per minute producer, they do already know what they have with him. So I don't know exactly what to expect minute wise for him, but it makes me think that maybe he's not getting quite as much run as we would hope.
So I kind of liked Chris Boucher a little bit heading into today, but now that we know that Baines is starting at 4,600, Boucher is 4,700. If you were choosing in between those two players, which would you prefer?
Between Baines and Boucher?
Yeah.
I think I would lean Boucher just between those two, because I think that basically the concerns that I just mentioned about Boucher, I think that there's an even lower chance that Baines gets additional run. Like he's Aaron Baines. He's expected to be their starting center going into the year. It's his first year with Toronto, but you do more or less know what you have with him, and it would be kind of surprising if they run him into the ground in game one. So I think between the two, I'd lean Boucher.
We do have a super chat here where Tevvin's asking us any idea on the minutes for Boucher. I mean, we're talking about him right now, so it ties in. It's always hard to say like an exact minutes, but I'd say like 20 to 22 seems like a reasonable guess for Chris Boucher.
I think my guess would be a little lower than that, like probably somewhere in like the 17, 18, 19 minute range. Again, like I think it's a volatile situation. Like if I had to guess between Baines and Boucher, which one ends up playing 22 or 23 minutes, I think Boucher is more likely than Baines, but I'm just not, there's so many like healthy bodies on this team right now that I'm not convinced that they run Boucher out there for extended minutes.
So here's something also in the favor of Boucher, the power forward and center eligibility that makes him a little bit easier to fit into lineups. Because, I mean, if you remember yesterday, what we had was there was a ton of guys who were only center eligible. And that did make it a little bit of a crunch for some of those center guys who rated out as people that we thought were good points per dollar play, just because it was very hard to fit them into lineups. Boucher, a little bit more flexibility with the power forward and center lineup. Also a guy who scored over a fantasy point per minute last year. I think that Boucher is an okay play. He's viable, but he's not necessarily one of my favorite options. I thought he was going to be starting earlier in the day, and I liked him a lot more then. So I think he's okay. Tevin asking, is it a smash spot for Boucher? I wouldn't go that far. I think he's okay, though, viable. I don't think you have to play him, but I don't think if you're rostering him, you can't play him either.
I think in tournaments also, moving somewhere else on the team, Malachi Flynn potentially at 4K. Nurse said that he's excited to see what they have in him. He was their first round pick this year, 29th overall. If they do, in fact, kind of limit Van Vliet and let's say keep him in like the 18 to 19 minute range, Nurse did say Flynn would be the backup guard. And so potentially you could see, I think, 21, 22 minutes from him.
Is there anybody else that you find of interest on the Raptors? There's nobody else that really stands out to me.
No, there's nobody that really stands out. Again, there's a lot of teams on this slate that I think are kind of similar in that they're essentially more or less healthy. They have a lot of bodies that they can play, and we haven't gotten any indication that they plan on playing any particular players a bunch of minutes. Toronto's one of those teams. So in those situations, I think that there's still going to be guys you can look at in tournaments from a raw scoring perspective or just from a playing time volatility perspective, but nobody that stands out as like a key piece that I'm building around.
All right, next game on the slate, we have the Cleveland Cavaliers taking on the Indiana Pacers. We also have starting lines for both of these teams. From the Cavs side of the game, I actually have a decent amount of interest here, in particular in Darius Garland, who's starting. So Cavs going with Garland, Okoro, Osman, Love, and Drummond as their starting lineup. Sexton out, Porter out, McGee out. So without Sexton there and Garland running the point, he's a guy who's not afraid to shoot and didn't really pass all that much last year. So I assume with him bringing the ball up and kind of other lower usage guys in the backcourt with him, I think there's a chance that Garland takes a bunch of shots during his time on the court. So I think that he makes for a pretty decent value play.
Yeah, I'm with you there. The only, I guess, kind of concern I have is there's a lot of front court value on this slate. So from a roster construction standpoint, I find myself kind of paying down there. But yeah, Garland should have the ball in his hands, which makes pretty much everybody more valuable for DFS. You would think that Cleveland wants to run him a decent amount of minutes just because they haven't played a game in like a year almost. And they are looking to develop these guys. So, I do think that Garland is fine. I also have interest in Chetty, 4,400 at, the forward positions where I am looking to pay down from a roster construction standpoint. He's certainly not the best DFS player, but if you can get, 22, 23 minutes from Chetty at 4,400 on DraftKings, I think he has value.
And then looking at the big men, we've got Kevin Love and Andre Drummond. So here's the issue I have with both of them. I don't necessarily look at them and say, like, I think they're terrible plays, although Love maybe. But with Drummond, I think he's a good point per dollar play, but I think this sets up as a really good stars and scrubs type slate. So I'm paying up for somebody. I'd rather go to, Luka or Giannis over somebody like Drummond. So that's where he just doesn't quite make my lineups. With that said, if Drummond was to put up a double-double in like 18 minutes, that wouldn't surprise me either. So do you have any interest in Drummond as a play?
Yeah, I have some interest in Drummond because just the way the pricing works and the amount of value that you have from a couple of teams on this slate, you can actually get Luka, Giannis plus Drummond and have a pretty solid lineup. But basically for me, he's not a priority as far as like I have Giannis. I'd rather just find the money for Giannis and Luka, where I'm looking for raw points, for example. But then you do still have enough salary to get one or two other kind of mid-range guys in there. So you start talking about guys like Malcolm Brogdon, Domantas Sabonis, Drummond, I think kind of all in the same breath with those guys where the minutes probably are going to be in the low to mid-20s, and they're really, really good point per dollar players. So kind of rotating through those guys, I think it makes sense.
And then touching on Okoro really quick, I think he's actually going to be a producing rookie this year. I think he's going to be a really good defensive player. I don't know what his fantasy production is going to look like, though, because I think he's going to be a fairly low usage player, and a lot of his NBA value is just going to come from being a good defensive player. So outside of maybe some steals and blocks, which would be more valuable on something like FanDuel than on DraftKings, it's really hard for me to trust Okoro. And then, we didn't really talk about FanDuel at all, but I just think it's funny to make fun of them because they changed the pricing for today, where not everybody's $100 anymore, but still they made everybody $5,000 and $6,000, so you could still play whoever you want. The pricing is essentially the same. They changed the number and they're like, oh, look, people complained about the product yesterday. Well, look at us. We did the exact same thing, but made it look a little bit different visually.
Yeah, it looks different, but everybody's lower than the average salary you have in your lineup. So it's the same thing. But yeah, I'm with you on Okoro. It just doesn't seem like outside of, people playing like max entry lineups, it doesn't really seem like you need to get there because you don't need that value. You don't really have any idea what to expect from him in terms of in terms of point per minute production. And there's guys that even if there's other rookies that even though we don't know exactly what to expect from them in terms of point per minute production either, they at least profile as guys that would produce at a higher rate.
Yeah, and somebody's asking here in response to Drummond, would we rather play Drummond or Giannis? It's Giannis for me, and that's even including the price. I mean, there's a decent price tag difference between them, but Giannis is such a good per minute producer. And even though it's the preseason, he's so good, especially at fantasy, that I think he just walks into fantasy points by being on the court. And you forget last year that Giannis played, right around 30 minutes per game. So even if he's only getting 20 minutes, it's not like that's that far off from what he did last year anyway.
Yeah, and if the thing is there is a price gap on DraftKings. Drummond's 7,900 and Giannis is 9K, but because of it being preseason, because of there being value and just the pricing structure, effectively they're not that different in price. That $1,100 doesn't really end up mattering that much. So I think that if I play Drummond, it's along with guys like Giannis and Luka as opposed to in place of them.
Hey guys, we are offering a special promo for $1. You could use the promo code Caruso and get access to our NBA package through December 29th. This only qualifies for new members, gives you access to everything we have to offer for NBA preseason DFS and the first week of regular season NBA, which includes projections, ownership projections, the lineup builder, and much more. So sign up today using the promo code Caruso. That gets you access to the NBA package almost up to the new year for just $1. So check that out. I know there was actually somebody just DM me on Twitter. And if you're watching right now, that is the promo code that you could use to sign up for Awesemo for cheap and give it a run. Next game on the slate, we have the Oklahoma City Thunder playing the San Antonio Spurs.
I think we forgot the Indiana side.
Oh, did we forget the Indiana side? All right, that's my okay. So Indiana side, and we have starters here too. That's my bad. There's a lot of information we actually have on the Pacers. Each of them I expect to play about 20 to 25 minutes. Starters: Malcolm Brogdon, Victor Oladipo, Aaron Holiday. That is not Justin Holiday. Aaron Holiday, Domantas Sabonis, and Miles Turner. Bubble superstar TJ Warren is out and is probably going to be out for a little while. He's dealing with a plantar fascia injury. It's pretty concerning, actually, because you missed a game in August with the exact same injury, and it's apparently still nagging him. He's probably going to miss at least the first couple of weeks of the season. I think that could really derail his year, but for tonight, I think the most important thing to look at is that it's Aaron Holiday starting and not Justin Holiday. So I think 20 to 25 minutes for Aaron Holiday at a cheap price makes him a viable value play.
Yeah, the concern for me is just that he probably won't have the ball in his hands too much. But, if you're going to get low to mid 20s from pretty much anybody at a cheap price tag, they're at least viable. But I still think I would rather go to like Brogdon or Sabonis from the Indiana side.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. It was just for me more of a price thing that made me gravitate towards Aaron Holiday, 4,800. He did produce fairly well last year when he was starting, but I guess there is a case to be made, but not a case to be made. It's probably accurate that if he was coming off the bench and was still playing the same minutes, that he'd get more usage and be a little bit more effective. What do you make of Justin Holiday then? Because obviously, we've got Jeremy Lamb. He's out, still coming back from a torn ACL without TJ Warren there. Do you think there's a chance that he picks up a lot of that usage off the bench?
I'm just not really that interested there because he's such a low per minute producer, kind of regardless of who he's on the floor with. And you have, obviously we haven't gotten to the Oklahoma City team yet, but you have a lot of 4K guys there. You have one 4K guy that I'm interested in from Phoenix that I think produces at a higher rate or is likely to produce at a higher rate. So it's kind of just not guys that I think are really necessary from Indiana outside of guys that actually are going to put up like high raw point totals.
I would have liked to roster Victor Oladipo if he was cheaper, because he's somebody that I kind of think is a little out of sight, out of mind after he struggled last year. But now an extra year removed from that really terrible knee injury, I think we could see Oladipo get closer to what he was pre-injury, which is a really good fantasy producer. But 7,000 is a little bit rich for me to pay for him. Same with Domantas Sabonis at 7,800. Like I'd rather roster Andre Drummond in that same price range.
Yeah, I'm with you on Oladipo. Like Sabonis is fine for me. One thing that's nice about Sabonis is that he does have power forward eligibility, so it's a little bit easier to get him into lineups. Also, he's $100 less than Drummond, which in some of the builds that I'm looking at right now actually does make a difference. But I think Sabonis and Drummond are very, very comparable.
Any other bench players here that you want to mention? The other thing that we should talk about is Jakar Sampson is questionable. Goga Patadze, he's questionable. So there could be limited depth in the front court for the Blazers. That could maybe potentially make somebody else viable, but they're just questionable right now. So it's hard to know what their status is going to be.
Yeah, nothing else really from Indiana that stands out to me.
All right, so now let's get to the team that I tried to skip ahead to before, because I actually do think that they're the most interesting team on the slate. That's why I really wanted to talk about them, is the Oklahoma City Thunder. We have a starting lineup for them. It's Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, George Hill, Hamidou Diallo, Isaiah Roby, and Mike Muscala. The list of players who are out for them tonight. We have Darius Bazley, Lou Dort, Josh Hall, Al Horford, Justin Jackson, Ty Jerome, Darius Miller, and Trevor Ariza are all out for the Thunder tonight. So this is a team that, as far as preseason goes, they have a relatively short rotation. And we already know what the starting lineup is going to be. I think this is the best team to target on the slate for value. And SGA is ridiculously underpriced.
Yeah, they've somehow added a couple of players throughout the day, but still with only 12 players, active, it's they have fewer active players than most teams run in their preseason rotation. So they have to give minutes to some guys. Gilgeous-Alexander last year actually played 90 minutes, including the preseason, without any of Chris Paul, Gallinari, Adams, or Dennis Schroeder on the floor. He averaged 1.14 DraftKings points per minute. You have him, at 5,900, kind of has to play at least reasonable minutes, you would think. So he's pretty much the first guy into my lineup. Then beyond that, you do have these value guys that you can rotate through. It's kind of flipping coins, I think, in a lot of situations as far as who's actually going to produce the best between guys like TJ Leaf coming off the bench, Mike Muscala starting, drawing the blank on Pokusevic's name, but another guy that should produce at a high rate. Who knows exactly how many minutes he plays tonight? My guess would be he plays somewhere in like the 19 to 20 minute range. Amadou Diallo certainly can get out there for 24, 25 minutes. So I think rotating through these guys, using them as your kind of core value plays, because most of them are min priced, just makes a lot of sense because the minutes sort of have to be there.
And I'll say this also, just back on the SGA point at 5,900 on DraftKings and even FanDuel, because some people are asking about FanDuel and the pricing there, where you could basically roster whoever you want. Even in that setting, I would expect SGA to be one of the highest scoring fantasy players on the slate. Because if you look at the lineup, that's low usage players that he's with. And he's somebody who's going to take a ton of shots. He's going to in the regular season too. When I was figuring out my rankings for the season, the projections, when I was doing my best ball teams, like I did nerf SGA a little bit because he was coming out ridiculously high for me, to where I was like doing my projections. And it's like, wait, I have been scoring more fantasy points like Russell Westbrook and Steph Curry this year. And it's just because you look at the Thunder, but you look at the Thunder lineup and it's like SGA kind of does everything. Who else is taking up usage for them? And I think that he's in line for a monster year. And I think we're going to see some of that to an extent in the preseason. 5,900, he's the first player I'd put into a cash lineup today.
Yeah, I agree with you. He checks like all the boxes here because you have him playing. He's young for one, so it's not like they're likely to be limiting his minutes. He's playing on a team that doesn't really have other high usage guys. You look at his production last year, as I mentioned, without those guys on the floor, and he averaged well over a fantasy point per minute. He's inexpensive. Like there's nothing that I dislike about Gilgeous-Alexander here.
Yeah, for sure. And any of those other bench players, I mean, we pretty much hit on all of them. I agree with you on Pokusevich. He's somebody who I think is a decent upside rookie. I don't know how many minutes he's actually going to end up playing this year, but with that said, that Thunder rotation is pretty thin. And if they're going to rest some veterans from time to time, he's somebody who could step into decent minutes. How about this? I think this is an angle to look at. If you could only play one Thunder value guy for cash games, who would it be?
That's literally what I'm trying to figure out as we talk. So my lean right now is Muscala in cash if you're only playing one, and then looking to Leaf or Pokusevich in tournaments, just because typically you're going to see starters garner more ownership than bench guys. And I think that the projections, range of outcomes, everything is pretty close to identical for all of these guys. Also, for anyone who's going to ask, I have no issue playing them together either.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with you on Muscala, and I was kind of trying to lead you in that direction because we did talk about it a little bit before. So I agree. I think Muscala starting at center, and then you just look at all the other big men that are out for this team, with Al Horford out and Josh Hall, Justin Jackson, just other guys who could occupy forward minutes, Trevor Ariza. There just aren't that many options. So I think that Mike Muscala probably plays in the neighborhood of 20 to 25 minutes. Like we were saying before the show, not a bad fantasy producer, scored only a little bit under a fantasy point per minute last year. And then you just look at the lack of usage in that Thunder starting lineup. And, he's somebody who wouldn't surprise me to see him hit, like 2 or 3 threes in the first quarter and then just kind of get, a little bullish on shooting for the rest of the game. So I'm on board with you there. I think Mike Muscala makes for a pretty good play. Got somebody in the chat here saying that SJA is a terrible fantasy player. No, he's not, and it's SGA. So maybe he's talking about somebody else. But no, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is going to be a beast this year. Like I'm very confident in that. And not to get too far off track, but SGA, if you had to pick one player to win Most Improved, considering the Thunder situation, I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here. Would you favor SGA? Like, isn't he a guy you think stands to take a massive leap?
I don't know if I would say favor because I haven't given it any thought, and there's probably guys that I'm just not thinking about right now, but like put in the conversation as a clear guy that you would think of. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the only thing really working against him is that he wasn't bad last year, but as far as like he could kind of run into that, like the Pascal Siakam problem where he was good. He was like really good and then just got even better. But yeah, I think that he's likely to take a step up. And, again, I mentioned last year averaged 1.14 DraftKings points per minute without these guys on the floor.
So I love that from the Spurs side of the game now, we don't have the starting lineup yet. It's like even in preseason, Popovich is like, yeah, I'm gonna screw with your starting lineup and not really give you that much information. So we don't know who's starting for them yet. This is also where the slate gets a little bit harder to find out, just because we don't necessarily know the starting lineups for some of the later games. But we do know Derek White is out, Keldon Johnson is out, LaMarcus Aldridge is questionable. So those are 3 of the 5 guys that I'm expecting to be in the starting lineup on opening night. So that is going to create some amount of value there. DeMar DeRozan, he is priced at 7,200. That's maybe a little rich. 6,100 for DeJounte Murray. If you're looking for a guy who's capable of racking up a lot of fantasy points quickly and probably isn't going to go that highly owned because he's kind of that, no man's land of price range at 6,100, I think there's some reason to roster DeJounte Murray in GPP. But this is another spot where I'm just so not confident in who the Spurs are going to play, because I'm not confident who they're going to play in normal situations. And now it's preseason.
Yeah, exactly. Like the Spurs are a team where if you're playing tournaments, you can definitely look here and kind of just hope that you hit the right dart throw. But they're a team that I think is pretty easy to ignore in cash games. You have DeRozan and Aldridge, as kind of the top projected guys, but there's really no reason based on past history or just expectation in general to think that Pop is going to run substantial minutes for Aldridge or DeRozan. Out of the main guys on this team, I do think Murray's probably the most likely to get decent run and useful run. And I do think he's a good tournament play, because when you think in terms of kind of optimal lineups and like top projected lineups, Malcolm Brogdon's going to pop over DeJounte Murray. So you're probably going to get more ownership going to Malcolm Brogdon at the same price point, and going to Murray in tournaments can be a good pivot. There's still obviously no guarantee that Pop runs him as many minutes as we want, but I think he's more likely to get, into the low to mid 20s than guys like DeRozan or Aldridge. Beyond that, looking to some of the cheaper guys, looking to Alani Walker, looking to Devin Vassell, these cheap young players that Pop probably doesn't care at all if they do play more minutes, would be, decent pivots off of like higher owned Oklahoma City guys in tournaments. But, to your point about not really having a good feel for what he's going to do, because he's difficult to predict in the regular season, much less the preseason, where you're talking cash and, kind of top projected guys. There's nothing that I'm really that interested in from San Antonio, just because I think that there's a lot of volatility in the minutes.
Just getting back to one other player, because somebody asked what we think about Frank Jackson from Oklahoma City, not a player we mentioned. Yeah, that's another min-price guy I think is okay at 4,000. He's probably going to play some of the backup point guard minutes. But I think a lot of those cheap Oklahoma City guys just go in the bucket of being viable, cheap options. Frank Jackson's one of them. Not necessarily a priority for me, but viable.
Yeah, one thing that I think puts Jackson a little bit behind the forwards and / centers that we mentioned is that most of the pay up options I want to go to on this slate happen to be guards. Giannis obviously isn't, but Luka's a guard. Gilgeous-Alexander's a guard. Brogdon's a guard. So I'm not really having any trouble finding guys that I actually want to pay up for at guard. Whereas there's a few forwards that I'd like to pay up for also, but I think that from a roster construction standpoint, I'm preferring to pay down at the forward spots.
All right, so the next game, this is going to be the one where we're going to have to talk about guys to pay up for. It's also the game that I'm probably most excited to watch of any of these games. Not that I'm actually going to sit around and watch any, but if I had to watch one of the preseason games, Bucks versus Mavericks would probably be the one. Also, guys, don't forget to like the video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Bucks Mavericks, Kristaps Porzingis is going to be out. He's going to be out for a little while. So Luka Doncic, I expect him to carry a pretty significant usage rating when he's on the court. I think the place I want to start with this game, if you could pay up for one guy between Luka and Giannis, and it's viable to fit both of them into lineups with the amount of value that's on the slate, but if you could only roster one of them, which way would you go?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you I'm rostering both, but I would lean toward Giannis just because I think the minutes projection is about the same. If I had to, if you told me one plays substantially more than the other, I would assume Luka gets more minutes, but my expectation is they play about the same minutes, but Giannis is just the better per minute producer. And that's not a knock on Luka because he's fantastic, but Giannis is just kind of the best in the league from a DFS standpoint. So rostering both everywhere. Well, actually, I'm only playing one lineup, but would be rostering both everywhere. Will be rostering both.
100%.
Yeah, we'll have 100% of both in my one lineup. But yeah, I mean, slight edge to Giannis for me. But absolutely love both just because you have to get raw points somewhere, and they have the two best per minute projections on the slate.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then like I talked about before, in terms of paying up, I mean, it's not that hard to get up to these guys because there's a lot of viable 4K options or guys around that low 4K number. So we're gonna have to get those points from somewhere. And I think it's really safe that we get points from Giannis and Luka. Like I saw earlier in the chat, somebody mentioned like, oh, I got killed by Trae Young yesterday. If you look at the first place lineup in the $15 yesterday, it had Trae Young in it because you just need to get those points from somewhere. And if you're going to get, whatever 20, 25 fantasy points out of a bunch of 4K-ish players, you get that same number from the more expensive guys. It's whatever. It's not a big deal. Those are just the safe points to lock in. So I think it's totally reasonable. I think preferable, particularly in cash, to jam both Luka, Giannis, and SGA in there also. And SGA is kind of close to min price anyway.
Yeah, completely agree. And I mean, even beyond your point, like you obviously didn't need Trae Young to win a tournament yesterday. He happened to be in the winning lineup. But if you're going into basketball season and you're already looking at the day before and saying like, I got killed because I rostered like the best player on the slate, it's going to be a long season if that's kind of how you analyze what you did the day before.
Yeah, if the guy who's 70% owned that was in the first place lineup, if that's what ended your night, then probably not the case. Other players on Dallas and Milwaukee, is there anybody that really stands out to you? Once again, we don't have starting lineups for either of these teams. Courtney Lee's out for the Mavericks. That's really the only other significant injury. There's also other guys who are pretty expensive. Like I wouldn't pay $5,800 for Tim Hardaway. I wouldn't pay $5,400 for Josh Richardson. And the one guy that I would think about here is Boban, just because he's such a good per minute fantasy producer, close to min price. Like Boban, why not play Boban in the preseason, right? Who doesn't want to watch a preseason game to see Boban? So I think, like 16 to 18 minutes from Boban is definitely in the cards. And in those kind of minutes, he could definitely get to over 30 fantasy points. So Boban is somebody I think is a viable, cheap option.
Yeah, not someone I would look to in cash games, but in tournaments, one thing that I think is important, because it's always tough to like talk about preseason slates because you feel like you just keep saying like in tournaments and just like naming everybody. But one thing that you're looking for when you do make your pivots are guys that actually produce at a high per minute clip. So if you do end up kind of on the right side of the rotation and you do get more minutes than people are expecting, there's a really good chance that player makes the most of it. Hoping that you get 20 minutes from a guy that averages 0.75 points per minute isn't really that great. Whereas hoping you get 18 minutes from a guy that averages 1.3, that puts you in a really good spot. So Boban certainly checks that off. There's if he played anywhere between like 6 and 16 minutes, I don't think it would be surprising. But if you do happen to get that 15 or 16 minutes, he's probably putting you in a good spot. So the lack of certainty around his playing time makes him someone I'm not considering in cash games, but the lack of certainty around his playing time does make him a kind of interesting tournament option.
Yeah, and the other thing too is the preseason to an extent is kind of fan service. And I mean, if you think about it from that angle, I think it's kind of safe that Boban gets some minutes, right? Because like who's going to bench Boban in a preseason game? That doesn't matter. He's one of the most fan-friendly players in the league. Everybody loves him. So I think I'm talking myself more and more into Boban as being an upside play as we go along.
Counterpoint, it's 2020 and there are no fans.
Yeah. But they got to sell those NBA League Pass subscriptions.
True.
And speaking of which, we've got to sell some Awesemo subscriptions also. So guys, it really helps us out if you give us a thumbs up, like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you want to try out our NBA product through December 29th, $1, use the promo code Caruso if you are a new customer. And that's a good way to try out our product for the start of the NBA season. So from the Bucks side of the game, outside of Giannis, are there any players that really stand out to you? There aren't really for me.
No, not that stand out. I mean, if you wanted to, like Middleton probably plays around the same minutes as Giannis, and that salary is kind of useful, just kind of filling in another spot. The one thing that I think that I keep in mind, and that kind of knocks Middleton down for me relative to someone like a Malcolm Brogdon, for example, is that if you're playing 20 minutes alongside Giannis, they're not likely to be your most productive minutes. So, as a tiebreaker, I would rather just not be rostering the guy that's sharing the floor with Giannis, especially in a lineup where I do have Giannis. If I'm not playing Giannis, then by all means, I think Middleton makes sense, just hoping that he's the guy that does a lot of the scoring while they're out there. But beyond those two, there's not too much. I mean, there's just not a whole lot from the value side that I really like from Milwaukee.
And then one other thing to mention is that we did just get the Milwaukee starting lineup as we're talking about the team. Drew Holiday, Dante DiVincenzo, Chris Middleton, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Brook Lopez. No real surprise there. DiVincenzo is expected to start at shooting guard to open the season, so he's going to be in there. But to your point, like you said, playing alongside guys like Drew Holiday, Chris Middleton, Giannis, it's hard to expect much usage from DiVincenzo, and he actually probably would have benefited more from a fantasy standpoint if he was coming off the bench.
Yep, agreed.
All right, next game on the slate.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to bring him up,
ahead.
and the only reason I do bring him up is he's kind of showing up in lineups I'm making. Do you have a take one way or the other on Dorian Finney-Smith?
Not really. He's actually somebody who, so talking about him from a fantasy standpoint, I didn't roster him a ton on DraftKings last year, but I did like him more on FanDuel just because of his defensive stats, where he's somebody who, there'll be a random game where DFS gets 3 steals and 2 blocks or something like that. And then it's like, oh, he walked into a bunch of fantasy points. The issue I have with him, let's see, where was his, 4,300. So the issue I have with him, assuming he likely starts, is it goes along with the other thing we were saying too, is Luka's probably going to take most of the usage there. And so 4,300 for DFS, maybe if he comes off the bench, like I still think he's going to play about the same minutes either way. He's just kind of whatever for me. I mean, I think I'd rather roster the cheap guys from the Thunder than him.
Yeah, I'm at the same spot. It's kind of like I keep in a lot of my builds, I keep getting to like at small forward, like Finney Smith or Cedi Osman. And it's just like, I don't want to roster any of these guys, but they kind of fit. So yeah, just wanted to know if you had a take that beyond, kind of not caring one way or the other.
No, I think for preseason, it's going to kind of be like, there are like 9 players I have a strong take on, and then everybody else is like, I don't really care about.
Yep, same boat.
But that's, DFS kind of falls in that category for me. Next game, we have the Memphis Grizzlies taking on the Minnesota Timberwolves. And actually, we just got a Timberwolves lineup also. I saw some people talking about it in the chat, asking about Karl Anthony Towns, and you were asking about him also before the show. Cat is starting at center for the Timberwolves. He spent some time away from the team. He had a pretty ridiculously rough offseason because not only did his mom end up passing away, but he also had 6 other family members that died from COVID in the offseason. So who knows how that's going to impact Karl Anthony Towns. I can't really put that too much into my analysis going into the games. Other than that, I think that after the fact, we're either going to say that it motivated him or we're going to say that it's the reason he struggled. Like, it's just going to be one of those things that's a narrative that's going to exist on the season, but we're not really going to know if it's a positive or negative impact until afterwards in terms of his basketball production. So Timberwolves starting lineup: Towns, Jake Layman, who is a Maryland basketball superstar for a very short period of time, was the NBA's points per minute all-time leader off the bench, but that was like 30 minutes into his NBA career. Josh Okogie, Malik Beasley, and D'Angelo Russell. So some takes on Towns. I think he's okay, but the reason I wouldn't really prioritize or even necessarily really want to put him in the lineup is I just think that Giannis and Luka are much better plays.
Yeah, same for me. You certainly in like tournament builds, you can kind of so like from an optimal build, I'm getting like Giannis plus Luka plus a couple of the mid-range guys, like of that Brogdon, Sabonis, Middleton, Drummond tier. In tournaments, you certainly could drop one of those guys to another like Oklahoma City value play or just value play from somewhere else, and then up the other one to Karl Anthony Towns so that you end up with all of Luka, Towns, and Giannis. I certainly think that's viable and it gives you a high ceiling in tournaments. But as far as like an optimal build, I don't really see a huge reason to do it because Minnesota is essentially healthy. Naz Reid, I believe, is the only guy out for Minnesota. And we haven't gotten any inclination that they intend to run Cat out there for like substantial minutes or anything like that. So he's kind of, I think, in the same boat as guys like Brogdon and Sabonis and Drummond, then just more expensive.
Yeah, and then talking about some of the other players, like I know people are going to want to roster probably Anthony Edwards, who was the top overall pick in the draft. And I know that people are just going to gravitate towards some of those types of players in the preseason, which makes sense to an extent. But I mean, I look at this backcourt for the Timberwolves, and this also applies to Anthony Edwards as we approach the regular season. There is not a lot of usage in minutes to go around. Like Ricky Rubio isn't starting for them. He's going to be a guy who could be coming off the bench. Anthony Edwards is coming off the bench. We already know that there's Malik Beasley. He's a pretty high usage guy. There's D'Angelo Russell. He's a high usage guy. And then when Karl Anthony Towns is on the court, they're going to want to run plays for him to get him the ball in the post. I don't really know what the usage is going to look like for Anthony Edwards when he's on the court for this game and for the regular season, or what his minutes are going to look like. I'm not going to say that he's not viable, but he's far from a priority for me. He's very low on the list of value plays I like.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's just for all the reasons you said, there's it's just kind of tough to see exactly how he gets involved and how he produces. Rubio coming off the bench, I don't think is likely to help. So yeah, I agree with you.
Any other players on the Minnesota side worth mentioning? The Memphis side, I think, is pretty ugly to figure out right now.
I think it's extremely ugly. But yeah, I think Minnesota and Memphis are both kind of similar. Like there's obviously guys that produce or are capable of producing at a high rate, whether you're talking about Towns or talking about Russell or talking about even, Rubio and Beasley to some extent, but there's no real indication that these guys are going to play big minutes. I don't have anybody in for more than like 20 or 21 minutes right now. And so that's just not going to push anybody towards the top for me. Russell also is expensive. Like he's $100 more than Drummond. He's $200 more than Sabonis. So it's just really tough for me to really love anything from Minnesota.
All right. From the Memphis side of the game, no starting lineup yet, but what we do know is that Jaren Jackson Jr., he's out. Tilly is out. Justice Winslow's out because he's been out for basically every game except for 8 of them in like the last 2 years. Kyle Anderson, questionable. Brandon Clark, questionable. DeAnthony Melton, questionable. And then Jonte Porter, also questionable to play. So there's a whole lot of injuries here. It's hard to really draw any strong opinions from Memphis. Other than that, I do not think Ja Morant is a good play at all. As a fantasy producer, he was pretty high variance last year, was okay on a per minute basis, but certainly not enough to justify an 8,500 price tag in preseason. Even if he's going to play, 20 to 24 minutes, it's hard for me to see him being a good play relative to the other guys in that price range.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just not that they're fully healthy, but it's a team that it's pretty tough to see how guys get enough minutes to be like the best plays at their position or at their price tag. So whenever that's the case, it kind of just knocks guys out of cash consideration for me, puts them, into tournament consideration. But then kind of to your point, $8,500 for Ja Morant, there's already so many guards that we've talked about that are we think good plays. And, you compare kind of across positions too to, Cat is not much more expensive. Russell's less expensive. Sabonis and Drummond are less expensive. There's a lot of ways that you can go even in tournaments that I think give you a little bit better play than Ja Morant.
So there is one value play that I think I also saw somebody in the chat mention that I think could end up being decent. That's Gorgui Dieng, who is a guy who we've seen have big fantasy games in limited minutes at times. And you look at all those injuries that the Grizzlies are dealing with in the front court, and this obviously depends on who ends up playing or not. But with Triple J already out, with Winslow out, and then we have Kyle Anderson and Brandon Clark both questionable, I think that there is a situation where we see, like 20-ish minutes from Dieng, and he ends up being a good value play.
Yeah, and then obviously the most important thing is that it's a revenge game as well.
Of course, that's what matters. Everything is he's gonna get on the court and he's gonna be like, I hate the Minnesota Timberwolves because they're one of, what's also funny about some of the revenge games for some of these like journeyman type players. Half the games they play are revenge games. These guys have been on like half the teams in the league, and they still keep switching teams to other teams because they're never all that good. But Gorgui Dieng is at least a pretty good fantasy producer when he's on the court, so he is somebody that I think is viable. Getting into the last 2 games on the slate, the new look Golden State Warriors taking on the Denver Nuggets. Also, no starting lineups for these teams. Injuries we have from the Warriors side of the game. Draymond Green, pretty concerning news for him. He's been ruled out for the entire preseason. They said they think he's going to be ready to go for opening night, but that's not really great news. James Wiseman, he's also hurt, and they've said that they're expecting to start Looney on opening night at center over Wiseman. So that's not really great news for his potential fantasy production or his prospects to win Rookie of the Year. So Warriors starting lineup, I guess what's most interesting we have to talk about is Steph Curry. Where do you think he fits in amongst the other high-priced guys?
I don't really think he does. We have Curry saying that he doesn't think anybody, or that he doesn't plan on playing anybody more than 20 minutes. He said that he wants to ramp Curry up kind of throughout the preseason, but that coming in, he's not expecting to play anyone more than 20 minutes. He's expecting to use the entire roster tonight. So outside of, obviously you could just make the argument that Steph Curry can go nuts in 20 minutes, basically the same argument that we've made for Luka and for Giannis, but those guys both produce at a higher rate than Curry does. So it's just really tough for me to get to anything from this team, knowing that that's Curry's plan. If I got to anybody, it would be Curry just because it's Steph Curry, but there's just so many, I think, other guards that I prefer that it's tough.
So the other thing that's hard about the Warriors, and we saw this a lot last year, like one of the reasons they were bad, and they were even bad in the handful of games that Curry played, they got outscored by like a ton of points when he was on the court last year. There was a lot of randomness there also. I mean, he shot something like 29% from the field. but they have a very deep rotation of just replacement level players. And it's really hard to really look at some of those guys and be like, oh, I like Smalley. Like I look at those guys. There's like 8 of them on this roster that are going to play like 15 to 18 minutes. So for the Warriors cheap guys, it's another thing where I kind of think the Oklahoma City Thunder are the barometer for value plays. And in that sense, I just don't think the Warriors stack up to them.
Yeah, I agree completely. Whenever you have it's kind of, like in the regular season, whenever you have a coach that runs like a 10 or 11 man rotation, it makes almost the entire team tough to get to in DFS. It's kind of the same thing in preseason, except obviously the numbers increase. But you have a team like in Oklahoma City that has 12 players, and then you have a team like Golden State where their coach says we're going to play every available player we have. It clearly is going to lower what you expect and from basically everybody on the team.
All right, so we have a question here in our premium Slack chat. Do you think the players that didn't play in the bubble play their guys longer? Not necessarily. I mean, that could be the case for some teams. Like, right, we saw the Knicks give their starters extended minutes last night, but we already have Steve Kerr, like Adam said, on the record saying that he's not going to play his guys extended minutes. So I don't necessarily think it's as far as do we view teams that played in the bubble versus didn't play in the bubble differently? It's just a team by team basis. We kind of have to go by coach speak and what did they say? So even though the Warriors didn't play in the bubble, I don't think that's reason to think Steph Curry plays more minutes than other guys because Kerr's already told us that he's not going to.
Right. I think that like absent other information, I'm okay kind of making that assumption, like assuming that a team like Cleveland is going to look to play their guys more because they're a young team that hasn't played in a long time and they want to develop these young guys. But once you have a coach coming out and saying, we're not doing that, I'm going to lean with what the coach says.
Something else to mention, because somebody brought up in the chat, the preseason rosters are expanded. It's not 12-man rosters. There's more guys on the team. So that's why we have a team like the Thunder who could rule like 8 players out and they still have players left to play in the rotation, is because these are deeper rosters. So just because a team has a bunch of guys out, that doesn't necessarily mean that that guys have to play like 30 minutes. It's not the case for preseason. The Nuggets side of the game, no projected starters yet. The only thing we really know here is that Will Barton is out. I don't really think we're going to see a ton of minutes from the Denver guys because as is, I mean, even in the regular season, we saw them towards the end of last year, they were a team that kind of played a deeper bench that spread out the minutes. And I think we're going to see a lot of that from the preseason also. They have a lot of guys they could go to here. There's nobody that really stands out to me that much. We've got Michael Porter Jr. all the way up at 6,700. That's not really a good play, in my opinion. We've got Nikola Jokic all the way up at 8,800. To me, I can't prioritize him over guys like Giannis or Luka Doncic. So nobody that really looks like a good play to me from the Denver starters. One guy that I will mention is Bol Bol, min price at 4,000. He's somebody who profiles as being a guy who could score well, fantasy point per minute basis. Really long, is going to rack up defensive stats, get rebounds. He could shoot the ball also, which kind of tends to do well for these kind of preseason type exhibition games. So Bol Bol at 4,000, I think, is a good value play.
Yeah, I also think that you kind of at least have to consider Jamal Murray on DraftKings at 5,600. You mentioned like Michael Porter and Jokic being priced up. Somehow we got Murray just like kind of really, really cheap. It's still, I think, a secondary play because I don't think he's like drastically better than Brogdon, for example, because we have Indiana saying that they're expecting Brogdon to play, low to mid 20s, and we don't really know what we're expecting from Murray. I think that Gilgeous-Alexander is ahead of Murray, but Murray's still, firmly in consideration for me at that price in any format. I'm with you on Bol Bol in tournaments, just, 4K and produces should produce at a relatively high clip on a per minute basis. So, if you get the minutes that you want, he's likely to do well, and he's likely to be relatively low owned.
Some injury news right now, but it's a player that we weren't interested in before, and that was Tim Hardaway Jr., who was somebody we thought was overpriced. He is now questionable to play as a game time decision because he took a elbow to the ribs in practice. With him being game time decision, I just assume he doesn't play because what's the use in playing somebody like Tim Hardaway, who's questionable play, maybe not 100%. So that's something to take note of. We do have a question in the chat. Somebody just wants for FanDuel, who are the overall top plays on FanDuel? Just some names to throw out. So here's the deal. I mean, we could roster anybody you want on FanDuel. Everybody's viable. There's no salary cap restrictions. They changed everybody from $100 to $5,000. Doesn't matter because you get $6,700 or whatever to spend per player anyway. I think it's still the obvious guys. Actually, one way you can even look at it is look at the top price guys on DraftKings, and those are probably the best plays on FanDuel. But still, it's Giannis, Luka. If you want somebody who's maybe not necessarily high priced on DraftKings, but I still think is fairly likely to be a top high scorer, I would go with SGA. I think that would be somebody who maybe a little bit off the board in terms of FanDuel production. I think would be worth rostering there.
Yeah, those were the three I was going to say. You can throw Cat in there. You can throw Drummond in there. But yeah, I mean, it's just the normal guys that you would expect to do well. Like the biggest, I think probably the biggest mistake that you can make on FanDuel as opposed to DraftKings right now is transferring like the DraftKings value plays to FanDuel. Like we obviously spent a lot of time talking about Oklahoma City and Muscala and all these, TJ Leaf and Diallo and like all the guys that can soak up some minutes on FanDuel where the salary doesn't matter. You're still not really going to be interested in 25 minutes of sub 1 fantasy point per minute for Mike Muscala. Like that would be a mistake. Whereas it's one of the better plays on DraftKings. Yeah,
totally agreed. Because when the salary doesn't matter, just play. Because it is a situation then where it's like Mike Muscala or Andre Drummond, and it's like, well, you're going Andre Drummond then because the salary doesn't matter. And Andre Drummond scores more fantasy points than Mike Muscala. I don't know, 90% of the time or something like that. There are not very many situations outside of just random preseason where Mike Muscala scores more fantasy points than Andre Drummond. So final game on the slate, we have the Utah Jazz against the Phoenix Suns. I do not believe we have starting lineups for either of these games. From the Jazz side, we do have Mike Conley is out, and we have Bogdanovich is questionable to play. Is there anybody that stands out to you as a decent play from the Jazz side? It is a no for me.
Yeah, nothing really from the Jazz side. If we get word that Bogdanovich is going to play and play reasonable minutes, he is only 4,500 on DraftKings, so he's in that same price range with Diallo and Chetty and Finney Smith and these guys that are kind of just garbage. So he would be interesting, but if you assume that he's out, I think that it gets pretty tough to prioritize much from Utah.
From the Phoenix side of the game, we also don't have a starting lineup. There is a player that I have some interest in with Chris Paul out. It looks like Cameron Payne. There's a good chance he starts at point guard. And talk about Cameron Payne. I don't know how he's in the league this long. He is so established himself as a not viable NBA player who's just stuck around forever. Tank commander for a while. He was a guy who just stuck around on a lot of bad teams on 10-day contracts at the end of seasons and helped them get to a better lottery pick. So Cameron Payne, I think he's viable. He's somebody who we've seen him have decent preseason games before. He can play well against lower competition. So I think Cameron Payne getting some minutes against backups at only 4,400 on DraftKings, I think that he is a viable value play.
Yeah, I think so too. I'll throw Jalen Smith in there as my favorite guy from the Suns. I haven't seen a starting lineup, but we did get word that the expectation is that you're getting like 16 to 18 minutes from the main guys on Phoenix. So you have, Jalen Smith, who was their 10th overall pick this year. They want to get this guy run in the preseason, or at least they should, to, kind of get him up to speed. He's only 4K. He's someone that should produce at a relatively high clip. So I do like going to him at only 4K. I actually have him ahead of the bench guys from Oklahoma City.
And any other thoughts on this final game? And then just to mention, because someone brought up in the chat, yes, Chris Paul is out tonight. Cameron Johnson is questionable. And then we've got Dario Saric also out. Any other bench players you have any kind of opinion on from the Suns?
No, it's pretty much just Jalen Smith jumping out to me.
All right. So if anybody has questions, we could get to them. We have about 5 minutes until lock. I'm just going to scan our Slack chat to see if anybody comes up. Thoughts on Richardson? There's so many Richardsons. That's so hard. It's like asking me what are my thoughts on Smith or Thomas or something.
One didn't even jump to. Is there a Richardson on this?
I assume he means Josh Richardson because he asked the question a little bit after the Tim Hardaway Jr. news.
Okay, yeah.
So
he is the only Richardson on the slate.
Okay, well that also makes it easier. But yeah, off the top of my head, I wasn't exactly sure which Richardson, but yeah. So Josh Richardson, if I remember, I'm going to bring up his price really quick. He's not cheap. He's 5,400 for Josh Richardson. I'd prefer to go stars and scrubs this slate. So not somebody that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I agree with you.
All right. Scanning the YouTube chat. Some questions about Darius Garland. Yeah, I like Darius Garland tonight. I brought him up earlier. Even on FanDuel, if you want to go for a really contrarian play, I think that Darius Garland is sensible. I wouldn't roster him with like a bunch of other off the wall plays. But if you're going with like all the chalk on FanDuel, if you're going with Giannis, Luka, Drummond, Towns, just all of the high price guys, I think that Garland is viable to throw in there as a contrarian play. I also like him on DraftKings at his current price. So what I said about him before, without Colin Sexton there and just a bunch of other lower usage guys in the backcourt, I think that Garland could play a pretty substantial role in the offense, take a lot of shots. It's Cedi Osman and Isaac Okoro in the backcourt with him. So Garland, I think, stands to pick up a pretty significant amount of usage. The question was in terms of would I prefer to roster Garland or Devontae Graham? To me, it's Garland. Which way would you lean?
Yeah, I'd lean toward Garland now that we've got, word that the Hornets don't expect to play their guys more than like 20 minutes.
All right. Then some other questions from our Slack chat. TJ Leaf or Mike Muscala? It's really funny, actually, that we were actually talking about these players before we went on. It's Mike Muscala for me as the starter. I know that you talked about these two a little bit before also, Adam. So do you want to rehash that?
Yeah, for me, it's in cash. I'm leaning toward Muscala because he's starting. In tournaments, I would lean towards Leaf and Pokasevich because I don't think that there's a drastic difference in projections. I don't think there's a drastic difference in range of outcomes. I do think that the starter just ends up getting more ownership.
And then who would I rather fade, Luke or Giannis? I'll say I would rather roster Giannis if I could only play one, which means that I'd rather fade Luka. I think both are really good plays, and ideally, particularly playing cash games, I think you want to go stars and scrubs and jam Luka and Giannis into those lineups. But if you could only roster one of them, I'd go with Giannis, because the thing with Giannis is he was just such a ridiculous per minute fantasy producer last year, scoring over 2 fantasy points per minute, that even him in 20 to 22 minutes, that might not be all that different from what his production was last year when he was playing, like 28 minutes most games anyway. So that is going to be Giannis over Luka for me. Let's see if any other questions are coming across. Bol or Towns? That is such a wild question of guys who are in different price ranges. Relative to price, it's Bol for me. Who scores more fantasy points? It's going to be Karl Anthony Towns. We do have a starting lineup for the Wizards here. Steph Curry, Andrew Wiggins, Kelly Oubre, Pascal, Looney, and Kerr said that everybody on the roster will play. Nobody will play more than 20 minutes. That makes it really hard to roster anybody on Golden State.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Let's see. Any other questions? Bol or Towns? Sabonis or Drummond? I lean Drummond in that case. How about for you?
I lean Drummond. I think they're really close, and the $100 difference has mattered for me.
Okay.
But if I can get to Drummond, I would rather do that.
All right. And then, this is an interesting one for you because these are two guys you actually like. So I think this is a little bit geared towards you. Between Jalen Smith and Mike Muscala, which one of them do you prefer?
Between Jalen Smith and Muscala, I have both right now.
Okay.
I would lean towards Smith just because I think he's a little bit lower owned, and I think he probably produces at a higher rate than Muscala.
All right, so that is going to bring us right about to lock, guys. Thanks for watching. Do us a favor, thumbs up on the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're a new customer and want to try out Awesemo, use the promo code Caruso to get $1 NBA access through December 29th. That will give you access to our preseason content, and then for the first week of regular season, you'll get projections, ownership projections, the lineup builder, all the stuff we have up on the site. So guys, thanks for watching the show. Adam and I will be back tomorrow because we've got preseason action every day this week. So Jordan, play the music out. Oh, did I?